Backseas Musical Podcast.
Throughout the last 100 years or so, there have been certain images that have not only become a part of our culture, they've also become a part of our history. Whether it be specific events in the news or in professional sports or pictures of people that have changed the world, photographs are sometimes all we have left when it comes to connecting with our past and our history. Today, everybody is a professional photographer, having access to a full photo studio by just pulling out their cell phones. What people don't always have the access to is the ability to capture things in the moment consistently. When it comes to rock music, there have been very few people that have seen as much as photographer Bob Gruen. Bob has not only seen a lot, he spent the last 50 years documenting those moments with some of the most famous photographs ever taken. Whether it's been with Ike and Tina Turner back in the early 70s, or with John Lennon, or the Rolling Stones, or Led Zeppelin, Kiss, Blondie, Bob Dylan, or even the Sex Pistols, very few people have captured those images of rock and roll quite like Bob Gruen. When John Lennon was photographed with his iconic New York City t-shirt, that was Bob Gruen. When Kiss posed in three-piece suits on the cover of their album Dressed to Kill, that was Bob Gruen. The fact is, you've probably seen hundreds and hundreds of Bob Gruen's photographs, and you probably didn't even realize they all came from the same guy. One very lucky guy who just happened to be at the right place at the right time and time again. Bob Gruen has just released his latest book, an autobiography entitled Right Place, Right Time, The Life of a Rock and Roll Photographer. And today, Bob Gruen and I are going to talk about all that stuff on Backseas Musical Podcast.
I'm very good. How are you doing?
Very, very good. I'm actually very excited to talk to you. I've been spending a lot of time trying to learn as much about you, and I realize that the more I dig, the more I see. I realize I have seen probably thousands of your photographs, never realizing they all came from the same guy. It's a remarkable amount of work.
Well, thanks. I do keep busy.
You've written a brand new book. Actually, it's really the first book that you didn't necessarily just compile photographs. This is actually an autobiography, Right Place, Right Time, The Life of a Rock and Roll Photographer. What inspired you to actually write a book with words in it?
Well, I've been telling stories all my life, and so often people said, you should write a book. But writing is different from talking. And it took a while to actually get it together and get the words down onto paper. But basically, because people have always been telling me they like my stories, so I thought I'd put them all into a book.
Your mom was pretty instrumental in inspiring you to become a photographer, right? She was into it as well, right?
Yes, my mom was an attorney, but one of her hobbies was photography, and she liked to develop and print her own pictures. So literally when I was 5 years old, she had me in the darkroom with her, teaching me how to develop and print pictures, and I just took to it. And I got my first camera when I was 8 and actually sold pictures when I was 11. So all my life.
Were you selling pictures of pictures of friends or family? How were you doing that?
Well, when I went to summer camp, some of the camp was put on a musical. I think it was Oklahoma, actually. And typically I was down in front taking pictures of them. I actually mailed the film home to my mom. She developed and made some prints out of it and mailed it back to me. And those are the pictures I sold to the campers in the play. I mean, basically that's what I've done all my life, taking pictures of performers and selling the pictures.
What's really remarkable is it sounds like a lot of what happened to you in your career was, I don't want to say by accident, but just a series of, incremental moments where this thing leads to that thing. It's like the amount of connections you've had over the years is astounding.
Well, there was a lot of serendipity involved, just being in the right place at the right time. That's where the title of the book came from. But I always say that then you have to do the right thing. You can't just be there. You have to figure out what to do and make it worthwhile.
A lot of your photographs tend to capture the mood or the emotion of that moment. Even like some of your non-portrait type of photography. I've seen some where, like I saw a picture that you did at a fairly young age of a fire or a guitar that was on the street. It was like there was an emotion connected to those pictures that you don't really see that in a lot of people taking selfies on their cell phones.
No, well, I appreciate that. Actually, from a young age, I admired Henry Cartier-Bresson and Man Ray, and some of the creators like that who captured more than just the facts. I always like to capture the feelings, and in fact, sometimes the facts, the subjects aren't exactly sharp, but the feelings are always clear. Because to me, rock and roll, is about the ability to express your feelings very loudly. It's about the freedom to express your feelings very loudly in public, and I try to capture that feeling of freedom.
Would you say your very first job was with Ike and Tina Turner, or was there stuff that led up to that moment?
Well, there were a lot of little jobs that led to that moment, and of my developing and learning how to use the camera. I lived with a rock and roll band for 4 years prior to that, so every time they got a new drummer, they needed a new picture. So I was learning how to take pictures of bands. But I took a great picture of Tina Turner while she was dancing off the stage in a strobe light. So there's actually 5 images in the one frame of film. And it just captures the excitement, the energy that was Ike and Tina. And then just, again, the right place, right time, we went to another Ike and Tina show. And I brought the pictures to show my friends. But as we were walking out, one of my friends saw Ike Turner and pushed me in front of him and said, show Ike the pictures. And he stopped and he looked at him and he liked him a lot. And pretty soon I was traveling with them and they took me to California. And my first album cover was a Tina Turner picture.
When you when you take a picture of a subject, and Tina Turner would be a perfectly good example, that's someone that performed with the kind of emotion that your pictures kind of reflect. So I would imagine taking pictures of a Tina Turner had to be pretty easy, considering the kind of electrifying presence she was on stage.
Well, easy in the sense that yes, she was electrifying, and there was a lot there, but you had to capture the right moment, And in order to do that, you kind of have to anticipate what's coming because you can't see it and then photograph it.
So you went on.
There was a lot of being in the right place,
Right? But you went on tour with them. So how many of those moments would you say you were able to capture correctly, and how many would you say were not as usable? I mean, could you list a percentage, or is that not really a fair way of doing it?
It depends on the roll of film, but you take a lot of pictures to get a couple of really good ones. You do edit down, and I think editing is key, especially nowadays that people shoot so many multiple images. The cameras can just shoot 100 pictures in a row. That editing is key. You have to really just pick the ones that really matter.
Does it help to have a personal relationship with them? I mean, it sounded like you developed a friendship with Tina and Ike and with a lot of your subjects too.
Well, growing up, I was musicians and actors and the people in the singing groups and anybody who would stay up late at night actually. And so it was just kind of my lifestyle. Like I didn't have to try too hard to keep up with late night activities. And it does help to get to be friendly with people. I mean, it didn't always happen. Some people it was just an assignment. I'd show up, take pictures, and leave. But some people I've got to be friends with. And then you have more access. You spend more time with somebody. You see them in more situations. And so you can get better pictures.
I saw a video on YouTube the other day, and it was a video that was put together for your 75th anniversary last month. So first of all, congratulations on your birthday. But also it was about the book. And it's a conversation primarily between you and Lenny Kaye, which is another guy who has not only played with Patti Smith, but has also done his own incredible work archiving and documenting rock and roll over the last 50 years or so. You've known him for forever. He's a pretty remarkable guy.
Yeah, I have known him for more than 50 years. Actually, it adds up. Who knew? But he is an incredible guy, a great writer. And when I met him, that's what he was doing. He was writing. He was an early rock critic for some of the magazines, Cream magazine and our own Rock Scene magazine. But then when Patti Smith started, performing her poetry more as a musician on stage, and she had Lenny backing her up with kind of a jazzy background soundtrack, kind of a, the way the beatniks did in the 50s. And then it just developed more and more. They got a drummer and a bass player and a piano player, and it turned into a rock and roll band, a great rock and roll band. But in fact, I just saw a video of Lenny and Patty out there entertaining voters online. They're still out there doing it.
You also, as well as regular photography, you were also pretty early on embracing video too. You had a video camera, and that some of the documentaries I've seen or the interviews you've done, shows video of Ike and Tina and of Patti Smith and Lenny on stage just together. Because those are the kinds of things that people have read about or heard about, but they may not have seen it actually on film, and you have that stuff.
Well, film was very expensive back then. Trying to shoot, and that was pretty much the only way you could record something in the '60s. With have to get film and then develop it and then get a place to, project it and watch it. And then in the 1970s, Sony came out with the very first portable video recorder, which I see people taking stereo color film, video with their phones nowadays. It's so easy. Back then, that was a 50-pound tape recorder that you carried on your shoulder that literally had reel-to-reel tapes. You had to thread the tape through the machine, and it was very touchy whether it worked or not. But it was a modern miracle because for $10 we could record a half an hour and then immediately show it back. So particularly at the beginning, I Cantina liked it because I could record a show, we'd go back to the hotel or even in the dressing room and show it back right away while it was still fresh in their mind. And Tina and the Ikettes would see what they did practically for the first time right after a show and be able to improve the act by, seeing how they looked from the audience.
After you left Ike and Tina and you went on to, that led to another, it was, I don't know if it was LaBelle next or Elton John next, but I mean, it was like boom, boom. You're like, it was like an instant connection was made.
As soon as I met Ike and Tina, things just kind of snowballed. Ike introduced me to a publicist who took me to a party where I met another publicist, and he hired me to shoot Elton John. At that point, it was kind of an unknown English piano player who turned into the most exciting piano player ever. And that same publicist took me to meet Alice Cooper, and I started working with them. And LaBelle, actually, when I was going to visit Ike, I think the first time, I met a woman near Vicky Wickham, and I remember her saying that she managed LaBelle. And apparently LaBelle was like Tina Turner, but different. And she was so true, and I went on to do 3 album covers with LaBelle. So as soon as I met Ike and Tina, things just started snowballing. I met all these other acts, and each time I would go to a job, I would meet more people. And so I just kind of fell into, there was no definition of rock photographer. That wasn't a career choice, in 1970. It was just something I did.
Yeah.
Because I knew rock and roll bands, and they needed pictures.
But clearly you fell into something that, there was a connection between the artists and you, not just because they liked you, but you were capturing moments that perhaps no other photographer was able to do. What do you think separated you from other photographers at the time?
I don't know. I never really felt competitive. I feel other people are colleagues. We just do, have different styles, different ways of getting along. I just had a way of getting along with musicians since I was a kid. It was just part of my lifestyle. I didn't go to CBGB's to observe the people there. I went there to get a drink and meet people, meet friends.
And then it wound up being a pretty fertile place to be taking pictures.
Well, it turned out a lot of those friends were pretty good at what they were doing, and it turned into Blondie and Patti Smith and, the Heartbreakers and with the Ramones. And, and the thing is, as far as access, it's a lot easier to meet people when they're starting out, like in a club where they'll come out and drink with the crowd because nobody's famous. Back then I couldn't get access to some of the famous acts, like Frank Sinatra was like way off limits, even Bob Dylan. But you could go to a club and have a drink and meet people, and then if you meet enough of them, a few of them might become good. I have hundreds, thousands of pictures in my studio that nobody ever wants to see. Lots and lots of bands.
You spent, you talk about those CBGB years, but even before that, the time you spent with the New York Dolls and the Heartbreakers with Johnny Thunders coming from that band. I mean, those visually speaking, the New York Dolls were pretty. I don't want to say if it's risque, but in 1972, that was a pretty shocking band. But
very shocking. The fact that they were wearing some women's clothes, which was illegal at the time. The fact that they put on makeup scared people. That seeing men in makeup blatantly, saying, here we are. But rather than a gay look, I think the New York Dolls dressed as made themselves up to look like dolls because women like to play with dolls, and it kind of worked because they had more groupies than any other bands I worked with. They were very popular, yeah.
And the Heartbreakers are a band that I don't think ever really got the credit that they were due. I mean, they were such a great band, and their one album, LAMF, is
very, very powerful. Heartbreakers were a really powerful group. kind of went to England and showed the English kids how to put energy into the rock and roll.
That's a band that I wish more people knew or got the credit that they deserve.
Well, they could have been better, but the drugs held them back. I got to admit, it's an example of that there was a lot of downsides to the '70s, and Johnny and Jerry were really hooked up into that. They could have been a lot bigger if they weren't.
You also spent a number of years as the photographer for John and Yoko. What was how did you get hooked up with them?
Well, when they came to New York, everybody knew they were in the city, but I hadn't met them. They actually, I read in the paper, they had an apartment a half a block from my house. But then I was included in the first book of rock and roll photography called The Photography of Rock. And the writer for that book liked me and my pictures. And at the end of the interview, he said, well, I'm doing an interview with John Yoko next week, actually writing a story about the Elephants Memory Band that was backing them up.
Mm-hmm.
But he asked me to take the picture. And that was the first time I actually met John and Yoko. And I remember being very, very nervous when I was walking up to the room to meet them. And realizing I couldn't take pictures shaking and trembling because I was so nervous. And I just took a deep breath, just relaxed a bit, and went in and just said, well, I'll give it a try. I'll do what I do, and I hope they like it. And it turned out that was the right formula because years later, Yoko said that the fact that I was relaxed let them relax, and that most people they met were very nervous. And the fact that I wasn't so nervous made an impression on them. And they liked the pictures I did that night. In fact, they used one of them in the package for the Sometime in New York City album.
What's amazing is here you are photographing one of the most photographed people in the world, and one of your photographs is perhaps one of the most iconic pictures that the man ever took. And it's John Lennon with the New York City T-shirt.
Well, that just kind of came together in a magical sense. I was taking pictures for his Walls and Bridges album cover, a whole series of close-ups of his face, and then we decided to take some more pictures for publicity. And I had given him that shirt a year earlier. I kind of liked the design. It was only sold by some kids on a blanket, really, literally on the sidewalk, homemade shirts. And I'd given it to John, and with the skyline around him, I asked if he still had it a year later. And he knew right where it was, so I knew he liked it. And he put it on, and it was in the middle of an afternoon where we were having a conversation. And the conversation with John was always fun because he was a very funny person. He kept changing lines into puns and keeping everybody laughing. So it was that kind of a comfortable, friendly mood, and I think that comes across in the picture. I think that's why people like it, because even though he looks like a pop star, he looks accessible and open and ready to have a conversation.
Is it for all the people that you've met and you wound up being comfortable with them and they wound up being comfortable with you? I got to believe this on the opposite side of that. There's also a few artists that were maybe not so open and maybe not so easy to photograph. Is there anybody like that would have come to mind to you?
Well, I kind of took a hard job as a challenge. Somebody didn't really have much expression, and I had to get them to, have some emotion. That was a hard job. There was one guy who was really fairly obnoxious, but so obnoxious I don't like to say his name and give him the credit for who he is. But usually I get along with people, and like I say, if a job was harder, I took it as a challenge. And doing that kind of a job gave me more satisfaction when I did it, when I got it done right. So I never think of them as obstacles. I think of them almost as fun, as a challenge that I can conquer.
I assume that in order to do this job, to be following bands all over the world and capturing that essence of their performance, you have to first and foremost be a fan of the music and the live performance. Are there, other than Tina Turner that we mentioned before, are there particular performers that you just were blown away by?
Well, yes. When the Fillmore East opened in New York, and me and my friends accidentally managed to sneak in, I had no idea there was a girl in the band Big Brother and the Holding Company. And when they first started playing, this woman is going absolutely bonkers. And I said, "Who is that?" And they said, "Oh, that's Janis Joplin." And I was totally amazed. I mean, the power of her performance was just different and better than anything I'd seen. But yeah, it happens a couple of times. not all the time. When I first saw the Rolling Stones, that was like one of the most emotional concert trips I ever had. I was young. I had no idea what was coming up, and all of a sudden I was in this room full of screaming people. and I was hooked. After that, I wanted more of that kind of excitement.
To go backstage after a show I mean, I've been backstage on a couple of shows, and what I find, in more modern times, is that unless you're in with the band, there ain't that much to see, backstage at a show. But you got access to people that was, really unprecedented, and you could, list them off. I mean, pictures of you with, the Who and with David Bowie and Iggy Pop and all these people that were performing. Did you find that after a performance they were just basically regular people, or did you find that there was a period where they had to come down from the intensity of performing like that?
Well, it depends on the performer. I mean, some people, go on and off the stage in their normal persona. Other people, like Iggy Pop, kind of turns into the Hulk before he goes on stage, and he does have to come down. Like you can be talking to him before he goes on, and then about 10 minutes before he goes on, I remember one time the manager asked us to kind of step away, and you see Iggy just start to vibrate and turn into this monster and run up onto the stage, and then come off, and he just kind of paces around for a while, and then he turns back into Jimmy Osterberg, and he's an intelligent guy.
Yeah.
Nice guy to chat with, But other people, it's the same persona. John and Yoko weren't any different on stage than off, maybe just a little louder. Actually, he could be pretty loud off stage, too. So it depends on the person. But I always approach people as people. Some people have more charisma than others, but we're all human.
One of the album covers that people may not even realize you did, but as soon as I saw it, it's like, I went to my record collection because I still have it. Was the Kiss record, Dressed to Kill. Back then, Kiss was just slightly under becoming the biggest band in the world. I mean, they were right on that cusp. They were about to explode. But the visual, I think everybody knew. But that picture is filled with humor and irony. Kiss in those suits like they're off to a business meeting. It's one of the great pictures of all time.
Well, it was actually part of what's called a photo novella. It's kind of like a comic book, but of photographs instead of drawings. And it was sort of by Cream magazine, where it starts out with Kiss are in their secret identity, as if their faces wouldn't give them away, but they're not wearing their costume, they're wearing business clothes. And they discovered that there's going to be a very bland concert by cleverly disguised, instead of John Denver, they said John Cleveland. And Kiss runs around town putting up posters for a fake concert, and everybody comes to it. And instead, Kiss comes out and saves the world with rock and roll. And that was basically the theme of the story. You can find it online nowadays, the Kiss comic. But that frame was one of the frames we took of them in the beginning, in their secret identity of the business suits. And when the band saw the picture, they loved it so much, they actually named the album Dressed to Kill based on that picture. And then we got the suits together again. Actually, I think Gene and Ace are wearing my suits because they didn't even have a suit at that point. And so I had to recreate the suits in the Electric Ladyland where they were recording to make it look as if they had done the whole recording session wearing suits and ties and looking like that. So it's quite fun to, have the evolution of it, starting with one idea and ending up with an album cover that everybody in the world knows nowadays.
But back in those days when they were wearing their makeup full time, you weren't allowed to take photographs. Nobody was allowed to take photographs after the show when the makeup was off.
Days, there were no photographs without makeup. They had, security guards that would travel with them if anybody tried to take a picture. Not everybody had a camera back then, but people had, little Instamatic snapshot cameras. And if anybody tried to get a picture of Kiss without their makeup, the guards would grab the cameras and have a big argument, try to take the film. And I remember the first night I worked with them because ordinarily I take pictures of a band before they go on. Then you take pictures on stage, and then you take pictures backstage, with any friends or celebrities that show up. But I went backstage after the first Kiss show, and Bill Aucoin, the manager, stopped me at the door. He said, "No, we don't allow any pictures after the makeup comes off." And I was like, "Really?" He says, "Yeah, you're done for the night." And it was actually New Year's Eve at the Palladium, and I went home to spend it with my wife. I was done.
Good for you.
The opening act.
Did they pay you less because you worked less?
No, I actually had to work more because I had to do a whole day's worth of pictures in the 10 minutes between when they get the makeup on before they go on stage. We had to do all these little setups backstage to make it look as if they had a life, and always looked like that. Holding a telephone. There's actually a picture published today. Gene sitting on a toilet in Japan. we tried to make it look as if they lived a life looking like that all the time. So it was a lot of work in 10 or 15 minutes.
You mentioned CBGBs and spending time there, and there's a lot of mythology, based upon that on that place, and the reality was it was probably a very filthy, smelly club that just wind up having.
It was it was a dump surrounded by bums on the Lower East Side. That back then, homeless, deprived people were called bums. And, there's broken glass on the street. It was really funny. As the place got famous in the 80s, you'd see, groups from Europe or Japan showing up in limousines to the famous club. And they'd get out and they'd stare at this dumpy little club. For years, everybody had these dogs that would keep them inside at night to guard the place, but they would crap all over the club. And a lot of times he wouldn't see where it was, and it would still be there when the bands were playing. So it was definitely a pretty funky club, but it was the kind of place where, Hilly was very different as a club owner, that he wasn't really looking to make a lot of money. He just wanted enough money to pay for the rent and have a couple of beers and watch TV. And it was sort of like when your parents leave and they leave your uncle in charge, and all he wants to do is have a beer and watch TV, and you kids can go in the basement and do whatever you want. But if there's a fight or you make too much noise, I'm not even too much noise. If there's a fight or you break something, he'll throw you out. But other than that, Hilly would let any band, learn how to play and learn how to be better. Most of the bands that started there were, learning. They weren't good. He didn't have audition tapes. You could come in on Monday night and play, and if you drew people, you could come back on the weekend. It was very good. And at the beginning, when it was a small club, and the local bands were just Blondie and Television and Talking Heads and those kind of bands, were the people in the audience. So
right.
Each week they were kind of playing to their friends. So they had to have a new song or a new outfit, something that nobody had seen yet, to make it a show. So it was very competitive in that sense. And that really helped them to grow and to be better.
But these bands did develop. I've heard stories about how Blondie was just, god-awful when they first started, but then really started to develop fairly quickly. And then they became among the first to start, cranking out regular hits, and they want to be, at the time, one of the biggest bands in the world.
Well, there was a moment when I saw them playing, and they were no longer a funky band, and they just had a smooth, tight precision going. They were playing hard at glass. The place was full, and I remember thinking, this music is bigger than this club. This music is going to go, further, and sure enough, it did. But you have to remember that CBGB's was open 365 days a year, Christmas and New Year's included, and they had 7 to 9 bands a night. And there's an awful lot of bands you haven't heard of, besides the 7 or 8 that became super famous.
So switching from, maybe more mainstream music to punk, and then, eventually spending time with the Clash and the Sex Pistols. That whole period was like a transformative period in music. It may not have felt like it at the time, but certainly it's had its, long-lasting, ramifications.
The first concert I could take pictures at, I kind of got a fake letter that I was representing somebody so I could get into the Newport Folk Festival for free, and that was the year that Bob Dylan played with an electric band. And to me, it was kind of a statement that rock and roll was the folk music of America now.
Right.
And so to me, it's all just been a progression. Seeing the bands in the late 60s, I didn't really work with many bands except the one I was living with. But then in the 70s, after Meet 19, I started meeting a lot of bands. And it was really just getting faster and louder. They say that the punks were just hippies with short hair. It was always the idea in rock and roll of having more freedom, having a better world, having improvements in society.
Obviously with COVID, it has changed things dramatically. There are no concerts right now to speak of, and some are planned. But just the business of concerts and live performance has changed dramatically in maybe the last 15 to 10 years or so. In your view, how do you see it different today than it had been?
Well, in the 60s, it was a lot more fun. In the 70s, there wasn't an idea that it was going to be a commercial idea. It was more about having fun and playing music and maybe meeting somebody, having a few drinks. But as it started getting bigger and bigger, like Led Zeppelin, other groups, Kiss started playing, arenas and stadiums. Corporate interests came in and started taking up the record companies, and the corporate interests were very different from artistic interests. And they really started exerting a lot more control. and a lot more formulas to what they were trying to sell. When I started working with Tina Turner and Alice Cooper and Janis Joplin, unique people. And then in the 80s, I started hearing people say, well, this is kind of like the AC/DC with an Alice Cooper singer. But you see, Alice Cooper wasn't like anybody. Tina Turner wasn't like anybody. And there was originals. And then by the 80s, it started getting more derivative. And people had seen a lot and they were copying more.
Do you think that's changed since then?
Well, now people have, access to so many resources, and you're seeing music from Indonesia and Mali, and rock and roll has split into so many genres. I mean, heavy metal is 15 different genres, and that's a whole genre in itself. So, yeah, it's really kind of diversified to where people can do so much more nowadays. The equipment is so much more available. The average computer is better than the studio that the Beatles recorded in the 60s,
Right.
You can do things on your phone that they couldn't do back then. So it's made it a lot more available to a lot more people, and I think that's a good thing. It kind of reduced the amount of actual number one hits that everybody knows because everybody's going in so many different directions. But I think that's good. People get their own expressions. Do
bands today still understand the importance of those visuals? I mean, for example, would you be given the same kind of access today as you would have 30 years ago?
Well, it depends on the band. Back then, early 70s, a band like the New York Dolls loved to be photographed. You couldn't take enough photographs of them. Whereas the Allman Brothers, felt like having a photograph taken was worse than going to the dentist. They were very reluctant to ever pose for a picture.
Right.
But, again, I was kind of lucky in my circumstance, the way I met them, which I describe in the book, that we kind of got along at the beginning.
Right. But then there's a band like Green Day that sees you as a real, asset. They give you loads of access to them. They've been pretty open, have you, with them?
Well, that was kind of unique for both of us. That was getting to the point where my career has gone on long enough that Green Day actually grew up seeing my pictures, and I really love the power of their sound and the power of their statements. They're a very committed band that makes a lot of powerful statements. And the fact that they knew who I was and they were thrilled that I liked their band, and I definitely liked their band. So it was kind of a mutual admiration society. And in fact, they took me on the road. They took me to Europe twice, which was I kind of felt like the Robert Frank with the Rolling Stones. I'm sort of the respected elder. And yes, they get access, which they don't usually give to anybody. The first time I was in their dressing room, I realized that I was the only one not in the band, that their family, the roadies even don't go in the dressing room. And yet they had invited me in to take pictures. So it was a very unique position. But, and also, we kind of got along. It wasn't just that I was a famous person they heard. When we met, we kind of had a similar sense of humor. They are very, very funny people to hang out with. The three of them, they're just always making jokes and practical jokes, and they're just fun. And we got along, and actually, it was a long time ago. So last year, I released a book of my Green Day pictures. Because Green Day Photographs of Bob Gruen. It's actually 25 years of my photographing Green Day. And with this COVID thing, they were supposed to be on tour. They were supposed to start last February in Singapore, and one by one, like dominoes, their whole tour got canceled. Which was a bit of a drag for me because I thought they were going to be bringing my books on tour with them, and that didn't happen. So, but the book's still out there. People like Green Day, I got a great book out there. Place, Right Time. The autobiography is what I've really been working on for, actually, on and off for 20 years. I've been wanting to write a book. I tried starting it several times, and it just didn't really come together until this past year when I met Dave Thompson. He's a very good writer who's written dozens, actually almost 200 books on rock and roll. And I've been trying so long to get this book done. When I heard that, I thought, well, he's finished 200 books, and I only need to finish one. So let's talk to this guy. And he was great. He took all the stories. I did a lot of interviews over the years and stories, and he managed to weave them together into a cohesive flow. And then I did a lot of editing, put it all back into the way I tell stories, into my words. And so far, I've been getting some pretty good reviews. People seem to like it.
Well, I mean, you've had an amazing career. Anyone who has given any time to photography and rock music has seen your stuff over and over again, and it's iconic, and it's a wonderful document to what the history of music has been like for all these years. So Right place, right time, the life of a rock and roll photographer. Bob Gruen, it's a real pleasure to talk to you today. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for calling.
You bet. Thank you. Thanks for listening to my conversation with Bob Gruen. If you like what you heard, you can email me at bax@rock102.com. You can also check out our updates on Facebook, Instagram, and Spotify. Thanks for listening to Baxi's Musical Podcast.